Today, we're going to be doing an intro to commercial class. So what do you need to know when you're trying to sell commercial real estate? What softwares do you need to be using? How much does it cost? How are you finding clients, right? All of these things. It's one of the more common questions I get on a regular basis is people that want to start doing commercial, but they just don't know where to start. Typically, they either want to do commercial because they think, man, the commissions are going to be much higher. I don't have to do as much work. Or someone comes to them and says, hey, I have a commercial property, will you sell it, right? So it's kind of one of those scenarios. So the first thing is why. We just said that. A lot of people think less deal flow needed. They figure maybe I could sell one deal a quarter and make my nut for the year, not have to worry about going out and dealing with, home sellers and home buyers that are emotional and want to be a pain in the butt and everything else. There's some layers to that. Another thing people think is bigger commissions, right? But one thing I tell people to think about when they're looking to get into this is what's the size of the pond of people that are buying and selling commercial real estate versus residential real estate, because that's a pond you're going fishing in. You know what I mean? What percentage of people do you think own a home? So residentially, if you took 100 people, how many people out of that 100 are homeowners? 66%. So think about that. 66% of all the people you talk to are homeowners already, which means they could have a home to sell in the future they've bought in the past. The flip side of that is if you then took the other 34% that were left, how many of those do you think would want to own a house? Probably still a substantial amount. Now, we know that affordability is an issue, rates are an issue, employment's an issue, credit's an issue, right? There's many reasons that people don't own properties, but the reality is 66% do, and there's probably a huge chunk out of that 66% that want to own property. The flip side of that, if you took 100 people and you said, how many own commercial real estate? I mean, what's your number then? Now, I couldn't find an exact percentage for that. That 66 is a solid number. It's pretty easy to track. Commercial's a little harder to track, right? Things are in LLCs, there's different ownerships, there's REITs, there's all of that stuff. But I'd say your buyer pool is probably less than 10% or seller pool. When you start thinking about that, it's much easier to go out and find a buyer for a property or a seller for a property than it is to say, man, I got this sweet 300,000 square foot warehouse. Let me post it on Facebook and grab a buyer real quick. That's something that's like, you really got to start thinking about is what's your pool of people, whether you're trying to pick up clients or whether you're even trying to sell property. But let's say you're the second person, the person where people are coming to you now and they're saying, hey, I have commercial property. I just want to sell it. So whether it's multifamily, whatever it is, the next step is to really look at like, well, what are the different property types, right? Because I truly believe everyone on this call, if they have a client come to them, you can learn the skills necessary. The reality though is that there are a lot of skills that you may not be thinking about when you first start getting into this. So the first thing I start telling people is, what do you want to sell? It's not like a house, because the reality is if you can sell a $500,000 house, can you sell $1 million house? 100%. God, like anybody that's coming to you like, well, I'm a luxury realtor, I stand out because I do. No, you don't. A house is a house. Or do you have a good marketing plan? Do you negotiate well? Do you know a contract, right? It doesn't matter if it's a $100,000 house in Petersburg or $2 million house on Monument. The process is pretty much the same. Your contracts are the same. The negotiating is the same. The MLS input's the same. It's just a matter of have you worked your way up in that level of luxury. But when you talk about commercial, it could be multifamily, and it could be multifamily anything from, really even 2, 3, 4 units that qualify as residential. We can still put those into commercial listing portfolios like Crexy and LoopNet. So it could be even duplex, triplex, quad. But then after that, after 4 units, it goes definitely to commercial. So 5 units and up, right? So then you have to start thinking, is it an A class? Is it a B class? Is it a C class building? These are things people are going to be asking of you when you start to list or when you start to help buyers. What class of multi do they want? Do they want a luxury apartment that's got top rents and doesn't need any updates? That's an A class, right? Is it B? Things are in decent shape, but it's not like they're pulling in necessarily top rents. Or is it a C minus? Is it something that, man, this building needs some love, we need some CapEx, we need some value add, we need to try to up rents? All of that's a factor when you're dealing with multifamily. But in the flip side, what if someone comes to you and has an industrial building to sell? Whole other slew of questions are now going to come in. How thick is the concrete slab that's in this warehouse? If you're brand new, you're probably gonna be like, huh? Right? Like, why does that matter, right? Well, they're gonna be, putting storage and pylons and everything else in here, depending on trucks driving and everything else. Like, that's a factor. How tall are the ceilings? Did you measure the ceilings before you did that? When you ran through the listing appointment, did you go over with the owner, hey, how tall is the lowest point in this warehouse? How tall is the highest point? Because people are gonna wanna stack stuff possibly. What about total power output? That's huge now because of data centers. So nowadays, if you're selling warehouses, is you're going to get data center after data center that's reaching out to you that's saying, hey, how much output is coming into this building so that I can actually run what I want to run? And if not, is there a plan? Can I call Dominion Power? Can I get the power? Where's the closest transformer? All of that stuff comes into play. And it's something that you may not think about at all until you're like, I got the listing, I put a price on it, and now all these things start coming in. It's going to be different on office space. How many tenants? Is it one anchor tenant? Is it multiple tenants? What's the vacancy? What's going on? Is it fully leased? Mixed use. Stuff like that where you've got commercial on the bottom and you've got apartments on top. You may think, oh, it's just a multifamily, but it's not, because as soon as you go mixed use, now your financing starts changing. What a bank is willing to finance on mixed use is different than what they will finance on straight multifamily. So you start getting into things like that. And then land. I mean, just raw land can be fully a commercial thing. We do tons of development stuff on land. If you were with us, I guess probably like 4 weeks ago, we did a whole breakdown on getting into land, just like we're doing now with commercial. And I sell land to Main Street Homes and DR Horton and Shell Brothers. It's a whole segment that I do it in my business, right? Because if I can pop off $10 to $20 million in land deals a year, that's pretty good. But the flip side is, what if it's not good for development? It could be for commercial development. It could be zoned industrial. It could be warehouse land. So you're going to have to start looking at, what's the zoning? Do I need a rezone? Do I have to look at a city or a county plan? See, a lot of this stuff is devoted on calling the county, calling the city. Hey, I've got this land here. It's 100 acres. It's agricultural now. What do you think the county would let us do with it? Because you may want to put in a neighborhood, but if the master zoning says it's industrial, they're not going to approve it. So that's something that you have to start thinking about with land, is what is the zoning? What is the use? Who am I actually selling this property to? By knowing that, then I can start to get a price. Because do you think it's going to be a different price to put a warehouse on land and buy than it is to build an apartment building or a townhouse or a residential neighborhood? All of it's a different math algorithm. So that's one thing to learn today. If you're not good at math, commercial's real hard. A lot of agents can get by with being like, I'm not very good at math. And it always blows my mind when they tell me that, because I'm always like, most of what we do is like comping and, 3%, 6%, percentages, closing costs, all that stuff. But you can still slide by with a basic calculator in residential. In commercial, it gets much more crucial to know your numbers, because most of your buyers are buying based on the numbers. If it's an investors, they're buying based on those numbers, which we're about to talk about. And if they're an owner occupant, the numbers still matter because the bank is now taken into account. Because the reality is, when you go buy a house, what do they look at? This is how much money he makes. This is what his credit score is. This is how much the mortgage is. Here's the debt to income ratio. Well, commercial's not like that. They're going to be looking at the debt service ratios on everything. They're going to be looking at what the income this thing is bringing in. They're going to be looking at much more. You figure out, what do you want to sell? Now, everything I listed, we do. I've sold offices, multifamily, industrial, mixed use, land. I don't care, but I've chose to learn it over the last decade. So the main thing is, you got to figure out, do you want to learn all of it? Do you want to learn one or two of those things? But it's not like houses. You kind of got to figure out there's different knowledge bases in everything. The next thing, once you figure out what it is, once you kind of figure out what your price is going to be, is it an owner occupant scenario or is it an investment opportunity? Because if it's an investment opportunity, there's going to be a bunch of terms that you're going to get thrown at you right off the bat. You're going to get people asking for T12s. So a T12 is a trailing 12. And so what a trailing 12 is it's the last 12 months of data, including how much income is coming in, plus all of your expenses. So think of it like a P&L. I mean, it's essentially a profit and loss statement. Typically, property managers can, if you just reach out to the property manager and say, hey, I need a T12, or maybe even a T3, sometimes you'll see, hey, this is a 3 month, then I can get a pretty good view of the last 12 months, because I may not want to run it fiscally. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm looking at January to December, well, we're currently in June, so I'm only going to have 6 months of data. But if I asked for last year's finances, I don't know what's going on from January to June. Does that make sense? So I may say, hey, I want the numbers for 2021, 2022, 2023, but I also want a trailing 12 so I can do my math on current 12-month numbers. Jason?
Yeah, so what's the difference between that and a P&L?
There's not much difference. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just what the managers are calling it when you're reaching out for it, and that's what they're going to be asking for when they reach out to you. You could look at it as like P&L a lot of times is going to be like a profit and loss statement for a business. It is the same principle, but if it's just a building, it's not really a business, it's a building. So, the managers are just going to call it a trailing 12 month of expenses, the ins, the outs. But there's going to be stuff on there that may not be on taxes. I mean, you think about it, on that T12, there could be some write-off stuff that maybe they're throwing in their taxes to try to write things off. That would probably come in on a P&L versus it may not on a T12, if that makes sense. So T12s are big. They're going to be asking for that. Tax records a lot of times. I mean, if you go under contract on a building, it could be very common for someone to say, hey, we want to see the tax records. Now, this can be an issue because notoriously, what do we do on our taxes? We're like, I'm not trying to show that I made anything. I want this building to show that I'm poor, right? So the reality is it's hard to have your cake and eat it too sometimes because you've been trying to avoid all these taxes, or the seller has. Now you pick up their pretty multifamily and they're like, oh, it's great. It brings in $200,000 a year in rent. It's going to cash flow like crazy. And then you're like, great, let me get that P&L. Let me get those taxes. And it's like, dude, it says you lost 20 grand every year for the last 3 years. I mean, that's what you're pitching to somebody, right? So then you have to make sure you can formulate a case to be like, okay, yes, it lost money, but it was because he wrote this off. He did that. You know, he paid himself $140,000 in salaries. There's all kinds of things that you have to start digging into, which I'll throw out right now. If you guys aren't using like Grok for stuff like that, Grok, a lot of people are using now to just analyze their investment deals. Like I actually have an analyst. I pay $150 an hour on any apartment buildings we buy now. And I give him all the numbers and he has in-depth spreadsheets and he will run through and run all the numbers to make sure it's good. And then I send him a check when we're done with that building. Nowadays, you can take all of those numbers and at least if they're put together, you could put it into Grok and say, hey, I want you to analyze all of these numbers for me so that you can tell me, is this a good deal? What is weak? What is strong? So if you're not using Grok, that's a really, 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 really good one to start looking into. Rent rolls. That's another thing they're going to ask for. So rent rolls, that is just an active run of current rents. That's it. It's just a fancy name for, can you show me all of the rents in place right this second without giving me all of the leases? Because once you go under contract within the first week, they're going to want copies of all of those leases so that they can match it and make sure that it's all legit. But until that point, typically a property manager can just give you a Excel sheet to serve as a rent roll. It says, here's all the units. This is what they're currently rented for. This is when the leases are up. Here's the deposit. And then you get a good idea because then you can see, hey, here's my rent schedule. If I have that rent roll and I see, hey, this building's bringing in $50,000 a month in rent, I can then go look at that T12 and I can see, hey, are they paying? Does that make sense? Because if I can see, hey, it's bringing in 50,000, but I look at the rent roll and they're only bringing in 35 grand a month in rent, what does that tell me? Either someone's lying or a lot of people ain't paying. You get what I'm saying? So then you can start to see the health of the building as you start to analyze. You see how much deeper this starts getting than your average house? If you're going to sell, it's knowing how to sell that to people. But if you're helping buyers, you also want to have this knowledge so that you can look and start seeing, okay, what's the rent? How much vacancy is there? How many units are rented, right? If I have a 10-unit building, that's great. But if only 6 are rented and I have a 40% vacancy, that's going to affect me at the bank. See, the bank's not going to want to give me a loan most likely if I have 40% of a building still vacant. And it gets even stricter with buildings that if you want to do like Freddie Mac loans, Fannie loans. I have a Freddie Mac loan we're assuming right now for a 57 unit in Ohio. We just did one that was a 60 unit building in November, and that building had 6 vacancies, which was right on the 10% margin. So literally to try to get it to close, we kept telling them like, you got to make sure you don't have any more go vacant or the bank's going to give us an issue with this. So we're talking rent rolls, T12s, tax records, and then it's figuring out cap rates and cash on cash returns. Who can tell me what a cap rate is?
Calculating it is net operating income over the property value, I think.
Yeah, nailed it. Typically, the cap rate's going to be, if I was to pay cash for this property, $1 million, I buy it for $1 million, it makes me $100,000. What's 100,000 of a million? 10%. So if I net 100 grand, the cap rate is my percentage that I net should I pay cash. Now that's after all expenses. So you would take your gross profit, $1 million property. All right, it's bringing in $200,000 a year in rent right now, but I have $100,000 in expenses. I'm just trying to use really simple numbers, so hopefully it makes sense, right? So you take the $100,000 in expenses off, you're left with 100 in profit. That is 10% of a million. You have a 10% cap rate. If cap rate is your total net income, if I was to not have a loan and I made 100,000 in that sense, it's a 10% cap rate, but I don't have the loan. What's my cash on cash return on my $1 million? It's still 10%. So my cash on cash on the million is still 10. You following so far? So the cap rate and the cash on cash are the same in this scenario. But now let's say I have to go get a loan for this property. So now I go get a mortgage. I put $200,000 down, 20%. I loan $800,000. Now my mortgage on that has to come into play. So what would that mortgage be? Let's just call it 5 grand. I know it's not, but again, I'm trying to give simple numbers. So at 5 grand a month, now I have a mortgage for 12 months. How much did did I pay in mortgage payments? 60 grand. So now I have to take that 60 grand out of my 100 because I had to pull a loan. Everybody following me so far? Am I confusing everybody? So you pull that mortgage off of 60, now I'm left with 40. So if I have 40,000 that now is profit, remember, how much did I put down? I put 20% down, okay? So I put 200 grand down. What am I making on my 200 grand down payment? 40,000. So what's my cash on cash return? 20% for those with quick math. Do you see now the cap rate as I'm advertising that building? It's still 10% cap rate. Because if I pay cash, I'm going to make 100 grand. That's 10% that I'm going to make if I paid cash. That's the cap rate. If I was to pay cash, then my cash on cash is still only 10%, even though I'm making 100 grand. But if I put 200 grand down and I finance it, I have to figure out what am I making on my 200 grand. And I'm not making 100, I'm making 40,000, but that's still 20% of the money I put down. So am I better off putting 200 grand and making 20%? Or am I better off putting $1 million down and making 10%? See, that's up to you and your investors. Me, I like to leverage because if I know I can make 20% on my cash, I'm going to go put 200 grand down on 5 buildings instead of paying cash for 1 building. And that's a lesson we can go over on another call as far as like proper investments. But do you get the difference now between cash on cash and cap rate? See, cap rate's just, hey, what's this thing out here if I paid cash for it? You're going to see that advertised on everything. But see, that doesn't necessarily mean that's your cash on cash return. And that's why you got to figure that out. So part of analyzing apartment building is going to be, I'm going to take whatever that building cost is, I'm going to put a mortgage calculator on it, and I'm going to see what money down I would have, and then does it cash flow me? Because if I do the math and I'm going to lose 50 grand to buy the building with a loan, it's not a good investment. It's got to be someone paying cash with a 1031. Hopefully I didn't lose everybody.
So the cash on cash includes like your debt service.
The cash on cash would include debt service if you have debt service. So that's why I'm saying if you pay cash, your cash on cash is the same as the cap rate because there is no debt service. But the second you add debt service in, that's when you're going to see now your cash on cash is based on the cash that you put in because you also leveraged a loan. And then that's what's going to matter most, right? Because at that point you're saying, if I want to pull the loan, I need to know how much money I'm going to make and is it a good return? Because if I put 200 grand in and I net $1,000, was that a good investment? Probably not. You know what I mean? Johnny, you got your hand up.
I mean, when you're talking about commercial, I would assume most people are financing. They're not buying $1 million, $2 million in cash as often as you would like $100,000 home.
You'd be surprised as you get into a lot of this because 1031 exchanges are huge. That's going to be like a big thing, especially if you're looking at stuff on market because so much stuff is priced where rates at 7%, 7.5% don't make it worthwhile. So that's why a lot of these investments you see out there, you'll see the people are like, great 1031 opportunity. If you ever see someone that says great 1031 opportunity, that just means it's a crappy investment. That's what all it means. Perfect for a 1031 exchange. Yeah, that means it's not good for anyone else other than someone that has a bunch of cash that they have 45 days to employ before they get taxed on it, right? So anytime you see that, you know you're like, okay, this one probably sucks. Johnny, another question?
So if you were to finance some of that purchase of that million example you did, what it just wouldn't be considered cap rate at that point? I would just say, hey, your cash on cash. Because if I know my buyer is going to finance 50% of it or whatever, yes, and I can't give him a cap rate, it would be a cash on cash at that point, or is cash on cash only for residential?
Yeah, so to not get too like overly complicated on one point, but they're great questions, and that's the whole point of this is we want to make sure you're getting this. So think about it like this. When you look at it on LoopNet or Crexy or wherever it is, MLS, you're going to see that cap rate. But if you know your client's putting down 50%, then you know that cap rate doesn't really matter as much. But you may look and see, well, if this thing's a 3 or 4 cap being advertised, it's probably just a crappy investment. You know what I mean? You start maybe looking at a gauge. You're like, you see a 6.5 or a 7. You're like, okay, this one may be worth doing the numbers on. But now what you need to do is figure, okay, if it's $1 million property and your guy's going to put $500,000 down, typically on Crexy and LoopNet, if they have everything in there that they need, you're going to have an NOI number, a net operating income. That's the money that they got their cap rate on, right? After all the expenses, not counting debt service, there's that net number. So as long as those numbers are right, you know, pending the agent did their job and they listed it properly. If I know now, okay, this thing's bringing in $100,000 net, then Johnny, all you have to do is go to a mortgage calculator, type in the price, put in your 50% down payment and then look at what that mortgage payment's going to be for the year. Because now you can just add that up and you subtract it out of the net. And now you know this is what my buyer's going to net for wanting to put this money down. And then if I know that, then I can do the math on the cash on cash, right? So if I'm like, oh, it's going to cost him 50 grand, which means he's going to be left with 50 and he's putting $500,000 down, what's his cash on cash? 10%, right? Now I know, okay, he's going to make 10% on his money. So when you're talking to your investors, hey, how much cash do you want to make? If they say at least 10%, see, now you've identified. Now you said, hey, I think this one would get you your 10% on day one. And oh, there's some value add. There's this, there's some vacancy, there's some things. So again, if you want to advise on this stuff, this is where there's a lot more knowledge. It's not like, did you like the kitchen? What did you feel about the backyard? It's different, right? This is a much broader spectrum of stuff. Thank you so much for tuning in to one of our weekly training calls. Obviously, you caught the recorded session, but if you're interested in catching any of our live sessions that we do them typically on Mondays. I'm going to put the link below. So if you want to join any of our trainings live so that you can participate, so you can comment, ask questions, feel free to come. This is for our EXP group that we have here, our Omega group of agents, but it's open to anybody that wants to join, really. So if you're looking for coaching, if you're looking for training, feel free to hit that link below, and we'll see you on one of our live calls.